Transformation Ground Control. Your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control. This is episode number 54. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Cheatham. Kyler, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
We are both recording this podcast today, as you can see behind me, in snowy, cold Denver, Colorado, although I'm sure there's other parts of the world that have it worse or that are colder than where we're at. But our kids had snow days today, and a lot of businesses are shut down today. So thanks for powering through the weather and the elements to do the show with me today, Kyler.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a child of winter. So if we were, somewhere hot, desert, no. But snow, I can handle. Yeah, this is my jam.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. The first 2 or 3 inches, I was enjoying it, but now looking at my driveway and realizing I'm gonna have to shovel that later and/or enlist my kids to do it.
Yeah.
Maybe realize maybe I'm not quite as excited, and also seeing the temperature dropping below zero later tonight. I'm sure, like I said, there's people in the upper parts of North America and parts of Europe that have it a lot worse. So I guess I shouldn't complain.
Right.
Yeah, so we've got a great show for you today, despite the weather, despite the elements. Hopefully, as you're listening here today, hopefully you're having great weather wherever you are listening in from today. Thanks for being here. I've got a great show for you today. We're going to start things off with sort of a rapid-fire series of hot topics that we'll cover. We're going to cover Industry 4.0 and manufacturing digital types of topics. We're going to talk about digitization in the auto industry, how data drives financial and digital transformations, as well as some other interesting topics. So we'll cover that in the first segment. And then later in the show, we have a first-time guest who's never been on our podcast before, but I suspect he'll be on multiple times now and in the future. And that is Clifford Martin, who is our executive vice president. And actually, that's inaccurate. It's not executive vice president. He's managing director of Third Stage Consulting in Africa. So it's our most recent office that we've opened internationally in Cape Town, South Africa. He's going to join us today from South Africa talking about how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable. So if you're going through a digital transformation, if you're working with a system integrator or a reseller, implementation partner, how do you manage those implementers and how do you hold them accountable? That's what we're going to talk about with Clifford. So I'm excited to have him on the show. And then finally, last but not least, the third segment today, we'll talk about the whole concept of technology agnosticism. Is that a word? Agnosticism?
It is now.
I just made it up because we do talk about buzzwords a lot on the show, and what better way to talk about buzzwords than to create our own? And that buzzword is technology agnosticism. Of course, I'm going to have trouble saying that term throughout the show, so bear with me on that. But we're going to have Nate Stroeher, who has been on the show before. He's a Director of Strategy and Transformation at Third Stage Consulting. He's actually recently promoted into a different role, so he's a practice lead now here at Third Stage in the United States. He's going to be on the show talking about just what does this whole concept of technology agnostic mean when you're going through a transformation? Why is it important? How can you be more agnostic as you go through your evaluation, your strategy, your planning, and your actual implementation as well? So we'll have Nate on the show to talk about that later in the show. But before we get to that, let's talk about some of these hot topics you've got here. This sounds like a really cool series of topics that you wanted to cover here today, Kyler.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start with Industry 4.0 because it was very interesting researching that, and probably all of our manufacturing professionals know a lot of this already. But when we talk about kind of the evolution into Industry 4.0, when we're transforming the manufacturing force, we're talking about all automation, robots kind of constructing products and what that looks like. And what we've seen a lot of businesses do is kind of create a flagship manufacturing facility that features a lot of these new automations, AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, those types of emerging technologies. However, it can be next to impossible from my research to kind of make an existing manufacturing warehouse without completely scraping it into that fully automated piece of it. And I just wanted to get your feedback on that. So we're talking about things like flexible piping, extensive wiring, harnesses, like completely redoing manufacturing cells because the robot has, mobility constraints and different components like that. And then also completely redoing the product and the way that it's made so that it can be automated through that entire work stream. So I was interested to get your feedback on that to see if you kind of think that as these types of technologies emerge and those efficiencies kind of take place within the workplace or the manufacturing floor specifically, do you think that we'll be able to kind of upgrade existing manufacturing footprints to actually feature these newer technologies?
Yeah, I think we will, but I think the caveat to that is what you said, which is it's not just as simple as putting in the new technology. Oftentimes you have to rewire or reconfigure your shop floor and or your warehouse, especially when you look at, a lot of manufacturers out there, a lot of warehouses out there have these legacy layouts that have just grown organically over time. So as the company grows, as they take on new products, new raw materials, or open up new job shops within the factory floor, they sort of just organically grow into a hodgepodge or unstructured way of organization. So, it's not just, to your point, you can't just put in technology and assume that it's going to work in that environment. Same with your people, too. In addition to the physical layout and maybe reconfiguring physically how things are structured, you also have to retrain people and revisit your internal competencies and sort of rewire the organization in that way, too. And then certainly your processes and workflows have to change to keep up with the technology as well. So, yeah, I think it's a great reminder that technology is just one cog in the big machine of transformation.
Yeah, and sometimes you think about these technologies as creating those efficiencies, but what are the things that you have to do as a business to be ready, to be able to consume and create business value out of those efficiencies? For example, when we're talking about Industry 4.0 and the connectivity of it, you really have to have a stacked technology system where it's not a bunch of different, software systems that are able to integrate with one another. The data has to be the exact same. It has to go through the exact same process. There can't be any sort of breakage in that or the entire system goes down. So I thought that was really interesting. We talk about integration a lot on this show, and I actually just did an interview on Digital Stratosphere, our other podcast, our sister podcast, about the 2022 trend that is integration. And this is kind of takes it to a whole new level. So lots of exciting improvements. It's just about figuring out logistically how you make that change as a business.
Yeah, it's a great reminder to organizations out there going through transformations that you can certainly invest heavily in technology, but you shouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. You have to look at the other investments you need to make to get the full value out of it. So, in other words, if you were to implement the coolest new technology that has all this upside benefit potential, but you're still really inefficient in terms of how the shop floor is laid out or how you get raw materials from the warehouse into the factory floor, or whatever the case may be, you can see how quickly you're watering down the potential upside of the technology, and you're wasting money by having this technology you can't use. So you'd be better off sort of redirecting some of that investment and focus to the non-technology pieces, whether it's physical layout or the organizational change or the processes and workflows or all the above. You've got to make sure you invest in the whole thing and look at the whole picture.
Absolutely. And something else I found when kind of researching those 2022, it's going to take me to 2023 to be able to say 2022, just so everyone's aware.
Without stuttering.
I'm struggling with it. But when we talk about trends like data, which we talked a little bit about last week, and really focusing on what does data mean? Like what is the point of actually optimizing that data, being able to consume it, and obviously being able to take action around it to increase your overall production. And a lot of what I've been seeing as far as the messaging within the industry is really focusing on the data should be driven by the CFO and really financial pieces behind it so that you can understand what is the ROI. And that's really the data to focus on, is we might have all of this really interesting insights, But until it's going to actually create business value around revenue or the bottom line or whatever your business objective is. So I wanted to we talked last week about a CIO talking about change management. So now here we have some CEOs talking about CFOs. So I wanted to see kind of your reaction of really kind of charging the financial side of the business to really manage and run data migration and management.
Yeah, great question. I guess on the surface, I'd say that that's a good thought. I mean, it certainly you certainly want to counterbalance the IT focus to where it's not just a technology project, it's not just an IT project. So I think that part of it's on the right track by engaging the CFO or maybe making the executive making the CFO be the executive sponsor. But that only gets you so far. So in other words, it's if you have a CFO as the executive sponsor and that sort of becomes the focus or the priority of the transformation, then you're probably going to get good reporting. You're going to have good GL, good financial processes, but it still may tell you more accurately how screwed up your operations are. So the good news is you got better visibility to know how screwed up your operations are. So you really need someone from the operational side too. And when I say operations, some people would argue that finance is operations, depending on what industry you're in. But I'm thinking more like if you're a manufacturer or distribution company, the more you can involve supply chain and some of the hands-on, factory floor type processes and involve that or engage those business stakeholders in the process, the more you're actually going to get the business value that can then be measured accurately by the CFO or the finance group. So I think you kind of have to have both. If you can get certainly IT involvement, maybe supplement that with the CFO and the COO or whoever's the head of your supply chain. And ultimately, it gets to a bigger point, which is there shouldn't be any one person that's sort of focusing just on their area. You really need to have that executive steering committee that's looking at the entire organization, because ultimately these projects can and should affect, impact, and improve an entire organization.
Definitely, absolutely, and that's kind of that holistic approach is really what's going to drive the success. And I think that's kind of the messaging throughout the industry. It's just bringing more people into that conversation that had been there in the past, right? So a lot of times we've seen it as an IT-driven project or an operations-driven project, depending on what you're doing as far as new technology within your business. But now we see people like CMOs coming in and chief sales officers and really working on how do we optimize the business as a whole, so we can make sure that we're hitting our enterprise strategies, to your point. Another really interesting piece that I wanted to kind of talk to you about that's kind of along those same lines of those emerging technologies is just kind of the auto industry and how they're going through a very significant transformation right now. Obviously, they've been highly impacted by the supply chain issues, by the shortage of chips and those types of things. And it's a really interesting model where we've seen really kind of hardcore hard goods manufacturing meet technology, because now really the car is a computer and it's managed through those different systems and interactive GPSs and all kinds of things. Also, in kind of touching on the 5G conversation that we had just a few weeks back, we look at their mobile hotspots now and creating that connectivity and the difficulties in kind of bridging into the telecommunication industry because it's heavily regulated, as we all know. So I wanted to get kind of your feedback on just being in an industry, if you've ever seen that transition from more of like a hard goods manufacturing to becoming almost like a technology company when that wasn't something that was expected.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of saw it maybe on a different scale with the retail, the bricks and mortar retail industry. Those companies have been sort of forced to become more e-commerce and data and technology driven organizations. They certainly still deliver goods and products at the end of the day, but it's a totally different customer experience, and they've had to change their business models to keep up. A more recent example might be the whole taxi / Uber / Lyft service model. Those are tech companies. Some would argue they're transportation companies, but really they're tech companies. And then same with food delivery as well. All the technologies around getting a home delivery of different restaurants to your home, and now even just having people that can bring you products from other stores besides grocery stores or besides restaurants. All that's becoming kind of an emergence of technology that's totally transforming or changing the business model or the way that people think about those industries.
Absolutely, and almost how the business is structured, right? And how that looks really building out that IT support, even if you do have a third party vendor that's really creating and implementing the software. How do you manage customer service and all of those different levels that maybe wasn't something that you did in the past?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite examples of that is a brand I'm super fond of, which is Rent the Runway, which is basically a way to rent designer clothes and then you send them back. So I always use them like if we have to go to a wedding, you order it through the app, they send you a bunch of different sizes, you wear it, and then you send it right back. And I know customers that have done that for things like maternity clothes or something that they needed on like a part-time basis. But when the founders built Rent the Runway, they built it as a technology company and focused it only on the user experience within the app, and then also raising capital to get that type of inventory, which I can't even imagine what that was like. But just that transformation into, it sounds like a retail business, but it's actually not. It's actually an app-based technology conglomerate.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me too of I don't think this is exactly what you're alluding to. I'm not familiar with the Rent the Runway or how their pricing works, but I don't think I'm in their target market either. I'm guessing.
I honestly don't know if they do men's clothes. They should, but I don't. I have no idea. So,
but it just brings up the point of this whole subscription model too. I think that's another way that technology has affected businesses. Even non-tech businesses are trying to figure out ways to create more of a subscription offering or subscription model, sort of like what Netflix pioneered, way back when.
oh yeah,
Back when they were mailing DVDs or
yeah.
whatever, they sort of pioneered that whole subscription model even before they become the tech powerhouse that they are now.
Yeah, and they've stayed that way, right? We've seen a lot of people go into that, either be acquired or anything like that. But Netflix has really owned that space and continued to evolve with the technology and stayed competitive in a lot of big industries. Obviously, are in that now. So, and it's almost made cable completely obsolete.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. Another example of how technology has totally disrupted an industry and made the incumbents somewhat obsolete.
right, absolutely. And the last thing I wanted to mention was about one of the software vendors we work with quite a bit, especially in our mid-market, which is Infor. They recently had their annual conference, and Kevin Samuelson, their CEO, talked about kind of the future of their business model. And they openly kind of talked about the issues they'd had in implementing their software, specifically with a large retailer, a British retailer, where they lost about $6 million in an ERP failure, which for a company of that size is pretty considerable. We hear the $1 billion failures with Nike and things like that, but really these do hit hard if you are more of a mid-market company. And they talked about their evolution to making their product more industry focused and reference things like the healthcare industry or the public sector, aerospace and defense, what that kind of looks like in more focusing on industry based. So we talked a little bit about kind of the evolution to best of breed and being more flexible solutions. I wondered if you might give us some insight or your feedback on if you feel like this is kind of where the software vendors will go and to really become a niche solution for specific industries, for that referencing a fact of being everything to everyone and having a lot of big, very public failures.
Yeah, first of all, I have to ask, was the failure of Travis Perkins? Is that the one that they refer to, or did they not mention the name of the
You're
retailer?
not supposed to put me on the spot. I feel as though we discussed this. No. Let's see. I think it's Elmer Perkins, if I am not wrong. So,
Okay.
Perkins fiasco that resulted in Infor paying the British retailer about $6 million after a failed implementation of M3 in the cloud in 2020.
Oh,
So
okay. Yeah, if anyone in our UK audience is familiar with them, I'd be
yeah,
curious to know if they know anything that we don't about that
yes, always
retailer and that transformation.
teach us,
Um,
always.
yes, exactly. But I'd say that you know you hit the nail on the head, which is that I think ERP vendors are always struggling with how can we create this mass solution that scales, that can do all these different functions for all these different types of businesses. The more they do that, the more they struggle with, say, because you mentioned auto manufacturers a minute ago, I'll talk about an auto specific ERP system, which is Plex Systems. So Plex Systems is a product out there in the marketplace that focuses on auto manufacturers. That's sort of their bread and butter. There's others too. I mean, other industry verticals have products that fit, within them, like professional services and government, nonprofit. Unit 4. Unit 4 is a product that kind of hones in on those industries. So you're always going to have like these big vendors like Infor. They're trying to be everything to everyone. Then you're going to have the Unit 4s, the Plexes of the world. Epicor, focuses on manufacturers, and there is always going to be this conflict between the two. Do we try to be everything to everyone, or do we provide industry solutions? And I think, it sounds like that's Infor's way of trying to walk a fine line between both. Although I will say Infor is a little bit more focused than, say, an SAP or an Oracle. I think SAP and Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics too, they all struggle a little bit more than maybe Infor does, because they are truly trying to be everything to everyone, whereas Infor does have sort of its sweet spots, and they're pretty, they're fairly focused when you compare them to some of the bigger vendors, although they are a big vendor. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think I think ERP vendors are going to have to go that way, just to ward off the Plexes of the world, the Unit 4s, the Workdays, or the Salesforce on the CRM side. All those niche players, they're going to have to do both, play offense and defense, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was refreshing from a software vendor to hear like, hey, we haven't done that good a job, so we're going to do a better job in these 3 areas. I think that's a really smart, strategic decision that we don't typically hear that transparency on the software side.
It's a great point. Now that you say that, it's just absolutely true. I don't know. Usually, it's more of a defensive, like, "Oh, it wasn't our fault. The client screwed up, and our technology is awesome. They just couldn't figure out how to use it." Whereas it sounds like they're saying, "Hey, yeah, we've got some vulnerabilities here, some culpabilities in how we implement or how our solutions used. So let's figure out a way to fix it." Which, you're right, that is refreshing. I think ultimately, at the end of the day, that builds a lot more trust with the market than if you just try and blame your clients, which I always found that fascinating. That if I'm a potential buyer and I look at a vendor who's blaming their customers for their failures, that's not at all what I want to hear. So
me neither. It's scary. Yeah, who would want to be a potential customer when you see them kind of like bashing their other potential customers? Because who knows, they're going to do that to you.
Yeah, especially when it escalates to a lawsuit, and hopefully, most organizations don't get to that point ever, but the thought of it potentially getting to a lawsuit and then being dragged through the mud publicly, in the back and forth, it's just, you would hope you have a better partner than that. But you're right, that is refreshing, though.
Yeah, and I enjoyed your conversation at the live stream with Clifford earlier this week. And just a reminder to our audience, Eric does his live streams every Tuesday morning. So make sure you can set a reminder on his YouTube channel as well that will notify you when they're starting. But we talk a lot about SI partners and just, vendor partners in general, and how to make sure that project ownership or that transparency translates when going through a digital transformation.
Yeah, and excited to have Clifford on the show to play you this discussion here, where we talk about how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable, which is a fascinating topic, something that we're passionate about, and we help a lot of our clients do just that. So we'll have Clifford Martin on the show here in just a minute, but before we bring him on, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also have we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello, and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, as well as all the audio podcast platforms like Amazon, Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts, among others. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, be sure to check us out and subscribe. And we have new episodes every Wednesday. So I'm excited for our next guest, I should say. He is a new guest, first time on the show. His name's Clifford Martin. He is someone I've known for some time. He's relatively new to the Third Stage team, and he's helped us open our office in Cape Town, South Africa. So he's our managing director of Third Stage Consulting in Africa, and he manages the team and clients in the African region. But that's not what he's here to talk about. I think he will allude to Africa, I'm sure, just because that's where he's at and where he's joining us from today. But the real focus is on how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable. And actually, before we even get into that, we're actually going to unpack where some of the challenges are. What are some of the common risks and pitfalls that organizations face when trying to manage their system integrators? And ultimately, how can you manage them better? How can you hold them accountable? And this is a really interesting conversation because this is one of the keys to why transformations fail. It's because organizations sort of abdicate responsibility. They outsource to their system integrators. System integrators do what's in their best interest, which is generate as much revenue as possible, which is not in the best interest of the client. And it creates this snowball effect of problems and challenges, lack of transparency, misaligned goals, all that stuff. And so what we want to do is unpack that a bit and understand why does that happen and how can we, as practitioners or as organizations implementing technologies and working with system integrators, how can we avoid some of those challenges? So with all that being said, Clifford, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Eric. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody dialing in. Wonderful to see the messages and people coming in and stating where they're from. So looking forward to the session. And certainly I would encourage people to pose questions and ask questions. I think if we can make it as interactive as possible, that'd be wonderful. Perhaps, Eric, then a very quick intro for myself. I'm an ex-CIO. I left the corporate world probably 12, 13 years ago. I did have responsibility for multiple ERP implementations during that time. And post my career in the corporate world, spent a number of years with various consulting houses from Ernst & Young to KPMG to Gartner. And last year joined Third Stage, and it's been an exciting journey. So great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And glad to have you here today. And I think this will be a fun topic to talk about. It's a very timely and relevant topic. It's certainly relevant to most organizations that go through implementations, and we'll dive into that here in just a second. But I think you and I have a fairly unique perspective in that we both came from sort of the dark side, if you will. We both worked at the big system integrators. We know how they work. We know sort of the inner workings of what happens there. And so what I wanted to do is talk today about some of the challenges of managing your system integrator, how to hold them accountable, how to ensure your project is successful, which, by the way, a bit of a spoiler alert, your system integrator is not responsible for your success. Typically, you as the implementing organization are. So what is it you can do to ensure that you achieve that success? That's sort of what we'll talk about today. But before I jump into that, and I certainly, by the way, at any questions you have, please drop those in the chat as we're going here today. I've got a list of questions I want to ask, but I'd rather take audience questions. So I'll get us started, but any questions you all have, please feel free to chime in and drop them in the chat here, and we'll get to those questions. But I guess just to start, Clifford, throughout Africa, just like other parts of the world, and you're based in Africa, but I think you and I both have more of a global view of just how these sorts of projects and massive transformations work. But whether it's Africa or any other part of the world, there's a number of failures that are caused or can be directly linked back to a failure to provide oversight and management of the system integrator. What are some examples of those sorts of failure points, or maybe just help us unpack a little bit? What are some of the risks or challenges that are inherent in these sorts of relationships between organization and their system integrator that oftentimes leads to failure? What are some examples, or some of those higher priority examples that come to mind?
Yes, no, thank you for that question, Eric. So I think, inherently we're in an industry that is focused on, I think, primarily two things, selling software and installing software. And often the misalignment in expectations between the industry that we operate in and the client's own expectations. And I deliberately use the word software installation. And perhaps I'm being a little bit harsh to their size, but essentially that is what they do. And I think often an organization is expecting a strategic partner, someone that's going to walk the full journey with them from, let's say, from business case to business benefit, and he's going to be them and guide them throughout that. And very often that's not the case. The primary focus of the SI is to deploy the software. And I think there's often that expectation gap and a failure on the part of the client then to properly manage the SI and ensure that they get out of the deal what they're expecting, and often what the marketing material has promised them. So perhaps to start, then perhaps let me just add a little caveat to that. SIs play an essential role. And I'm not kind of trying to diss them in any way. They do play an essential role. And certainly the ERP projects that have an SI on board are much more likely to be successful because they do bring structure and focus and a certain discipline and methodology. But once again, they do need to be managed. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not that people want their projects to fail, obviously, and it's not that they want the relationships to get sideways, but oftentimes they do. Why do you think that is? I mean, what are some of the, just in your experience, what are some of the root causes of why you think organizations struggle so much with that relationship and managing those system integrators, holding them accountable, and really extracting the value they bring to the table, but not letting it get out of hand or go off the rails? What are some of the reasons for that?
Yes, I think there are issues on both sides of the fence, and by that I mean both in terms of how the manner in which the SI constructs and approaches the particular ERP or digital transformation project, as well as on the client side in terms of the capabilities that they require to ensure success. And very often, just a definition, a common understanding of what constitutes success, or for that matter, what constitutes failure, is not present, and there's no common agreement around that. Certainly nothing embedded into the contract that talks to success. So I do think there are failures on both sides, and as you correctly state, one can never outsource accountability for success. That has to reside with the client. I think we all know and accept that, but so often it's not the case. So often it's sometimes, I think, convenient for the client to kind of pass that buck to the SI and expect them to drive success. And then I think, Eric, what I find it to be extremely important is the whole contract negotiation, and what are we actually bringing the SI on board to do? Because SI contracts, and I've reviewed many of the Tier 1 SI contracts, they're pretty standard. And I think the client needs to understand what the SI will not be doing. There are certain capabilities that, and we can unpack that in a bit more detail as we go through the conversation. But there's certain capabilities that they simply do not bring to the party. And standard SI contracts are primarily framed in technology terms, and the deliverables are framed in technology terms. Whereas very often what the client is trying to do is to achieve some business outcome, some improved operational experience, or bringing new business capabilities to the party, or enabling their strategic objectives, whatever the case may be. So there's this disjoint between the two, and I think if clients do not very forcefully ensure that the SI statement of work talks to what they're wanting out of the project, we already start off from a place where there are these misaligned expectations, and it's very difficult to bring that together thereafter.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there around the fact that technical deliverables aren't necessarily what organizations are trying to get out of these transformations at the end of the day. It's certainly a key part of the output. You need those deliverables, but there's a lot more to it than just delivering a system that works from a technical perspective. So I think that sort of myopic focus that system integrators have, which is why you hire them, by the way. You hire them because they have that depth of knowledge. They know the software really well, whatever software it is you're deploying. But it's the other stuff outside the technology that ultimately makes the project successful, whether it's the process improvement or the change management, the architecture and data migration, the overall program management. And that's typically stuff that the system integrators don't bring to the table. It also seems like that a lot of times, tell me if you agree with this or if you have thoughts on this, but it seems like also there's a sort of two other dynamics at play when organizations are managing their system integrators. First of all, the organizations typically aren't experts in whatever sort of deployment you're doing or any sort of digital transformation, which is why they've hired the system integrators. So there's on one hand, you can understand why you hire the system integrators. They're there to sort of fill the competency gap that you don't have internally. But that lack of knowledge and that lack of experience can lead to sort of a blind management of the system integrator, which can be challenging. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a dynamic you've seen as well?
Yeah, such a good point, Eric. And my first action point is, if I engage a new client, is to have some type of executive boot camp. Because we kind of assume that the executive understands what a typical transformation or ERP journey looks like. What are some of the critical phases and deliverables, some of the critical decisions that they will be called upon to make throughout this journey. And they don't, and it's probably unfair to expect them to do that. And if you look at the average ERP or digital steering committee, we kind of take the different managers of the different business domains or lines of business and kind of bundle them together into a steering committee and expect them to oversee and drive success. And I think that's unreasonable. So one has to ensure that the executive is educated on their oversight role. And let me also say that how we define these ERP transformational journeys, the default from their side is going to be to define it as primarily software installation or a technology project at the very least. And I think the executive's role is to take a full life cycle perspective on this and look beyond. Deployment of the solution is not success. It's, as you correctly say, it's an enabler. So we now have the enabling technology in place, but exactly how we're going to leverage that in support of the business objectives is something that the executive need to play long after the SIs popped the champagne cork, declared victory, and moved on to the next project. So I think executive education and ensuring that they stay in the game is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you need to know, it's not that you or I would suggest that an organization needs to become an expert in digital transformation before they embark on one, because that doesn't make sense. Sure. And that's not realistic. But you need to educate yourself enough to know, at least enough to know what kind of questions to ask, how to push back or challenge assumptions that SIs might have. They've got their cookie cutter boilerplate approach that may or may not fit with your needs. And ultimately, it's up to you to say, hey, these parts of your methodology or your approach works, but here's what we think we need to do to modify to fit our situation. And that could be, cultural nuances. If you're a risk adverse organization, for example, and you just move slowly as an organization, you can't just come in and force fit a fast deployment. You've got to sort of right size it for your organization, just as one example. So I think just knowing enough about these implementations, being self-aware to know how we can kind of meld these two competencies together, our own internal competencies with the system integrators. I think that's a big, an important point as well.
Yeah. And perhaps I can add to that in terms of if we're talking about capabilities within the client organization. One often finds vendor management to be quite poor, or at least not at a mature level where they can effectively manage their SI and hold them to account. And just having that kind of level of professional skepticism. You talk about pushback, absolutely, because we do know that the SI part of their agenda is going to be to drive additional revenue, often through change requests or customizations or additional functionality. So having that professional skepticism to push back and ask, is this really necessary? Is this within the scope? What are the implications of this? Is it priority? Can we do it post-deployment? is extremely important. And then the vendor management, I think is, and let me add to that as well, a third capability, program management, especially when there are multiple SIs involved or multiple projects within a broader program. It's so important that the client organization has a mature program management capability, typical a PMO office, in order to pull that all together and orchestrate it and drive the integration and ensure that there's at least a common approach, common methodologies towards a common integrated goal. So I would say those three capabilities: the executive know-how, and oversight, the vendor management capability to kind of manage the SI, and then the program management capability from a delivery perspective to pull this all together.
Right. Yeah. Very good point. All right. Thanks for that, Clifford. We're going to take a quick break and jump back into this conversation. But before we do, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come. Relax.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Clifford Martin. We're talking about how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable. Let's jump back into the conversation. Just before we keep going with the questions here, just to give you a quick overview of where people are joining from today. I'd ask the question to open up, where are you joining? And I ask people to drop that in the chat. Just a few examples here. We have someone here from Florida State University in Florida. We've got someone from North Carolina. We have someone joining on LinkedIn from South Carolina in the United States, Columbus, Ohio in the United States, as well as an international audience, as I mentioned, too. We've got someone here from Toronto, someone joining from the UK, Brooklyn, New York, which is not international, at least where I'm at, but still a global audience, and someone from Kuwait and India, just as a few examples. Of where people are joining from today. So thanks everyone for joining and letting us know where you're at today and whichever platform you're watching on. Again, feel free to drop any questions you have for Clifford or I as it relates to this topic, and we'll get to those here in just a moment. So some of the issues you've just talked about, Clifford, why do you think they're so prevalent, not just in Africa where you're at, not just in the United States where I'm at, but throughout the world? Why is this such a global challenge? It doesn't seem to be something that's just pockets of the world are struggling with it. It seems to be a pretty global problem. So why is that? What would you say the root causes are?
Yes, Eric, yeah, it's interesting. It is prevalent, and I find it very interesting that the same issues that we're discussing now, if we were having this discussion 5 or 10 years ago, we'd probably cover a lot of the same ground. Yeah. So these things seem to be perpetuated. But nevertheless, we need to also understand that SIs have tremendously powerful marketing machines. They come with a very strong, experienced team. They have a very slick approach in terms of engaging and embedding themselves within organizations. And I don't mean this as an affront to SIs. SIs will do what SIs do. I think it's incumbent upon the client to manage that, as with any vendor or partner or with any type of project within the organization. So I do find it both frustrating and interesting that it seems to be very similar issues, that the technology changes, but the issues tend to stay the same. And I do think that, if we just take contract negotiation as one example, you have a tier one vendor with a big team often sitting in the background of technical people, attorneys, legal input, senior partners negotiating, and you have some poor guy in procurement who's probably never done this before in his life, representing the client organization. It's an absolute total mismatch, you know. Somehow these issues do seem to continue. Exactly what the answer is, I don't know. But I do think that given in the last few years we've had a number of high public, certainly in this part of the world, failures with in the ERP, in the transformation space. It's public knowledge. It's been in the public space. Some of the big tier one consulting houses have been involved. So I certainly think that organizations are kind of waking up to the fact that they have to take control of these projects. They have to be a lot more skeptical. They have to interrogate things in a lot more detail, and manage it a lot closer. So whilst I say that the issues seem to continue at the same time, and let's face it, I think what one also sees is that organizations appointing third parties to provide some independent program assurance and advice on an ongoing basis and assist them in this space. So whilst things stay the same, there is some positive news, and I think there is some positive things happening in terms of better managing SI.
Yeah, it's a good point. I agree with you, by the way. I think I'd take your point even further, which if you go back 20 plus years, back to when I started my career in the space, it was largely the same. You had the same dynamic, the same challenge, and some of the same root causes that that organizations struggle with in that management of their vendors. And I think the key, one of the key takeaways that I always leave clients with or encourage the market in general to think about this is, view it as your project. You're almost like think of yourself as sort of the general contractor building a house. You've got subcontractors and different experts that you're bringing to the table, but ultimately you need someone as a general contractor to manage those resources. Your system integrator is one important component, but you might have other people that are helping with change management or data migration, or your internal resources, of course, are critical to the project. So you just need sort of that global program management view. And that sense of ownership, that sense of empowerment that, hey, this is my project and I'm going to make decisions. I'm going to take input. I'm going to listen to my advisors or to my system integrator. But at the end of the day, this is my project, my business, and I've got to do what's best for my business. And I don't think enough organizations have that confidence or that mindset. I think a lot of them just think, for a lot of the reasons we've discussed, they just think, hey, I'm going to outsource this to my system integrator. They're the experts. I don't know enough about this. I don't have time to deal with this. So therefore, I'm going to sort of outsource this and abdicate responsibility to the system integrator. So I think it's a really good point, a series of points that you make there.
Yes. And I think, Eric, to continue on that conversation topic, what one has seen, in my view, is that we have at least seen a shift from IT departments or IT organizations within the enterprise managing almost solely and exclusively managing these projects to a greater involvement from the business side. And, to the extent where business managers and super users and subject matter experts are seconded almost on a full-time basis to the projects and play quite a significant role as a significant stakeholder group, and as they should. So I do think that's positive because it ensures that it brings more of a business slant to it and at least positions the organization to better achieve the business objectives of the project.
Right.
So I think that's a positive.
Absolutely. And I'd be curious to hear from the audience here, especially because we have people from so many different countries, if these are some of the dynamics you've seen, or if you've seen some different dynamics potentially in your part of the world. And speaking of that, we have a couple other guests that have joined that have also indicated where they're from. Deborah, who's a connection of mine on LinkedIn, says bonjour from Paris, France. I don't know if it's too early in the day to say bonsoir yet. I'm not sure what time of day you switch from bonjour to bonsoir. I always get confused on that, but either way, hello there in France. And we also have Abdul from Pakistan joining as well. So thanks everyone for being here. So when you think about some of the larger system integrators, and you and I both come from an environment or from one of the bigger system integrators, what are some of the unique challenges of dealing with a larger system integrator that organizations should be aware of, like a Deloitte or Accenture or a KPMG, whoever it may be?
Yes, I think it's always a question as to what model does one adopt. Is it a multi-vendor model? Do we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and give it all to one large SI? And then pretty much be fully dependent on that SI. So there are different models at the opposite end of the spectrum. I have seen some organizations quite successfully cherry pick the best independent contractors out of the market and utilize that. That's an exception. So I think that is an important question at the outset of the transformational journey or ERP project. But I personally do favour a bit of a mixed model. I think having, and certainly I do favour building a very mature capability in the organisation to be able to manage these different vendors. But one's always going to have a lead SI. I think that is important. And it does sometimes make sense. I mean, we go back to our earlier point, there's certain capabilities that the SI does not bring. So you have a choice as to whether to plug that gap yourself as the client or to bring in some independent players. And the typical areas are data cleansing and migration, training, user acceptance testing, change management, post-go-live support. There's often a kind of hypercare period for 2 to 4 weeks where the SI stays on board before they try and kind of hand you over to their outsource arrangement. So I think there are pros and cons. And one thing that I think is absolutely essential in terms of managing the large SIs, Eric, is that one has to have some type of predefined quality criteria linked to the deliverables, clearly defined in the statement of work, and preferably linked to the billing schedule, so that it's not just a time and material driven contract or fixed price contract, but there's some incentive for them to ensure that they deliver to a predefined and documented level of quality and completeness, whether that's testing or design or data migration or customization, whatever the case may be. And certainly the standard SI, tier 1 SI contracts are not going to come with these. They are not going to give you the ammunition by which to manage them or the tools by which to manage them more effectively. You need to, as the client, ensure that you embed that in the contract up front. And then it's easier. It's not easy, but it's easier. I do find that the tier 2 vendors are more open to negotiation. They're more flexible in terms of their standard contract T's and C's and statements of work. But certainly at the tier 1 level, I think it's quite a tough negotiation process to get those types of clauses embedded in the contract so that you can better manage that SI.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I agree totally with that. And it seems like, with the big system integrators, it seems as though there's so much money at stake for these system integrators when they have these bigger projects. If they've got 10, 20, 50, however many full-time equivalents on a project, that's a big revenue stream for them. And so one thing I noticed when I was at one of the system integrators is we would spend an inordinate amount of time just figuring out how could we not only keep those 10, 20, or 50 resources on the project, but how could we add a few more? How could we get some more people embedded in the project? And there's also a sense of sort of a curtain, like don't look behind the curtain. Like if I'm the project lead or if I'm the partner at one of the system integrators, I remember being at the system integrator, there was sort of an imaginary curtain there that's like you would have the lead face of the team that would go deal with the client. But everything we were doing behind the scenes, there was almost like an intentional arm's length distance. So the client didn't have the visibility to see why there were so many people on the project. What were we doing? Who's holding us accountable? And so it's a conflicting interest. There's a conflict of interest there because the system integrator is trying to maximize their revenue. You're just trying to make your transformation successful at the optimal cost. And those two things are in direct conflict. So is that a dynamic you've seen, or do you have any suggestions on how to navigate that?
Sure. And if I may just divert to the questions, there's a great question I've just noticed from, I'm not sure if it's Hassan Kabara, talking about how to manage that SI, and specifically the example that they mentioned is post-go-live. And the point being made is that very often there are only the issues only surface a couple of months after go live. And I think it comes back to your point, Eric, and the issue we were talking about earlier around how do we manage their SI in terms of ensuring the quality of their deliverables and the quality of solution that they deliver at the end of the day. And I tend to advise clients to steer away from and talking in the post-go-live space now, to steer away from time-driven measures, i.e. we will provide 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 weeks support, and move towards quality-driven metrics. we will be on board until you have executed all your critical business processes, until a critical mass of your end users have logged onto the system and are able to access and perform their duties, until you have executed all your significant business cycles, whether that be the budgeting cycle or performance management cycle or year end or month end, whatever the case may be. So I think and of course it's too late then, when you do pick up issues, because probably if you hadn't read the fine print in the contract, through the process of user acceptance testing, you've adopted the solution, and to a large extent, you've diluted your ability for remedial action, for recourse, and going back to the SI and saying, hold on, there's some issues over here which emanate from the project. So I think it's so important that we have those quality metrics throughout the different phases, as well as post-go-live, and that we hold the SI to account to ensure that the solution is within a reasonable time stabilized in the business, and that the organization starts to leverage, and it at least is on a trajectory towards achieving the original stated benefits which gave rise to the project. So to me, it does come back very much to ensuring that the statement of work and the contract is properly structured so that you can hold the SI to account for their deliverables.
Right. Yeah, and even just within that too, just taking a more active hands-on role to know, what are these different work streams, different tasks and deliverables that different team members from the SI are working on. And, being a part of that, because I think, again, a lot of times organizations take sort of an outsourced mentality or a delegation mentality where system integrator is going to do it for X amount of time and money, and I'm not going to worry about how it gets done or how the sausage gets made. But you should worry about how the sausage is made, because it's your business. I mean, you're the one that's going to be living with this for years or decades to come. So you need to make sure you're involved in that. All right. Thanks for that, Clifford. We're going to take a quick break and jump back into this conversation. But before we do, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Clifford Martin. We're talking about how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable. Let's jump back into the conversation.
Sure.
What about this? Here's a question that's somewhat similar, and this is from Sam Graham. Hello, Sam. Good to see you again. Sam is a regular attendee for a lot of these live streams we do, and a great participant. He always has really good questions. But the question is, you mentioned training, but do companies need ERP education as well so they can understand and challenge the SI's advice and decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. And it comes back to our earlier discussion about executive bootcamp, and not just at the executive level, but absolutely, Eric, and thank you for that question. And it kind of, to me, starts with how do we define this journey? Because if we're going to allow the industry or the SI to define it, it's going to be pretty much defined as a technology project with success achieved at the point of deployment of the solution. And of course, we all know that's not the end of the project. It's not even the beginning of the end. It's perhaps the end of the beginning, in terms of that all your work still lies ahead of you in terms of deriving business benefit. And there's no good reason to implement an ERP, in my view anyway, even a technical upgrade, unless it's going to achieve some business benefit, or as a minimum, remediate some risk within the organization. So I do think that defining what this project looks like, what is that life cycle, and the role that the executive needs to play over the full life cycle is fundamentally important. So in a nutshell, absolutely, it is unreasonable to throw, a hodgepodge of executives together and expect them to successfully play a meaningful role in over the full life cycle of the project. I think it's unreasonable without some education.
Right. What about, and this sort of relates to this whole education concept and a lot of the things we've been talking about so far, but what about bias? How does bias from the system integrators, how does that affect a project in terms of, certainly by this point, by the time you've deployed or employed a system integrator, you already know what the technology is you're deploying, but it seems as though there's biases in how technology gets deployed, and there's biases in how much of that technology you should or shouldn't use that can be in conflict with the best interests of the organization that's actually implementing. So what are your thoughts? How does bias fit into all these challenges we're talking about?
Yeah, I think clients are often naive and perhaps not unexpectedly. We need to recognize that there is some relationship between the solution providers and the partners who implement them. So the Oracles, Microsofts, SAPs of the world, and the tier one SIs. So the question is always, what do we do first? Do we find the solution ourselves and then bring the SI on board? Do we use the SI to find the solution and then possibly deploy them as a partner on the journey? And there are pros and cons and to all those different approaches. But certainly one has to, I kind of like this term, professional skepticism. One needs a high dosage of that when dealing with SIs. And once again, SIs do what SIs do. But we do need, and from the beginning right through to the end of the project, because let's face it, they are going to try and generate additional revenue. And in most cases, the senior partners and directors on that project are personally incentivized to generate additional revenue. And there's certain ways they're going to do that. I often find that, I like to think it's an extreme example. I had an example where a senior partner for a tier one vendor actually chaired the client's change advisory board, i.e. the forum through which all change requests came through for increasing the scope of the project. Now, that's a clear conflict of interest. One cannot have that because with the best will in the world, you cannot expect that individual to be making objective decisions around your business, your money, and to what extent you increase the scope with the requisite implications on the budget, the quality, and the timeline of the project. So I do think it comes back to ensuring that there's very clearly defined roles, and that in terms of the decision-making that resides and is retained within the organization, we cannot give that up to the SI because it is unfair to expect them to make decisions in our interest as a client when they are subject to all these other pressures back in their own organization to grow the account.
Yeah, and it's not just from a services perspective either. I mean, that's probably the bigger, more immediate risk that you have is that the SI is trying to grow their account, grow their revenue stream from the services side. But then there's also this bias on call it the product or the technology side, where it's sort of like you're kind of going in with blinders. If you're implementing SAP, for example, I'm thinking SAP first for everything, which may be the answer most of the time, but there may be parts of your business where we should not be using SAP or whatever ERP system for that. We should be looking for a third-party bolt-on, or maybe we should be creating a custom solution. I mean, that's not the end of the world if we do something like that. But your system integrator is going to push you toward that product in all instances, or in most instances. So I think that's a challenge a lot of organizations face too. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think, Eric, it comes down to the request for proposal and the RFP and understanding what your requirements are. And I've seen some organizations, and I think it's actually a good tactic, is to have a specialist company come in that is not an SI and assist them in formulating the RFP, or at least running business process workshops and requirements gathering sessions with their end users to better understand exactly what are the current pain points, what are the future requirements, what's the strategic intent of the business, what new capabilities do they require, is it a tier one solution, is it a tier two solution, what's the best deployment method, is it on-premise, is it SaaS, and what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different solutions out there. And I quite like that approach, because then one gets to a perhaps not a detailed blueprint, but a fairly low level of detail in terms of understanding what are our current requirements or what are our future requirements and how big are the gaps, and having that separate. And of course, if one does that correctly, it does then reduce as a positive impact on the cost structure for bringing an SI on board, because a lot of the design work is already done, and one can then continue that. It becomes reusable and repeatable throughout the life cycle. So one way of dealing with that bias that you refer to, I think, is to firstly understand extremely well what you're wanting out of the solution, exactly what you're wanting it to do, and number two, having that exercise independent from both the SI and the solution provider.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you've hit on another thread here as far as, you know, how to counter, what's the antidote to some of the challenges we're talking about. We've talked about the education and how to, you know, educate yourself so that you can at least know enough to ask the right questions and challenge assumptions. The other is to take ownership that we've talked about. And then, you know, you've talked about a couple other things here as it relates to managing that relationship and really ensuring that you're not being biased in that process, and having that. The third thing you bring up, or the third thread, is just sort of that clarity of vision, that clarity of what we want to be when we grow up. The better you understand that, the less likely you are to fall into these traps where if you don't have a clear vision of what you want to be when you grow up, now all of a sudden the power dynamic is shifted. Now you've become even more dependent on the system integrator. They're taking even more control, more ownership of the project, when really what you should be doing is tilting that back towards you and taking that control. And I also, by the way, really like that term you used, professional skepticism. I always tend to use the word buzzkill, but I like professional skepticism better because that's a more positive or professional variation of that as well.
Yes.
I wanted to just bring up a really interesting point here, just to, if anything, to validate, Clifford, that you and I are not the only ones that are have this sort of jaded view of system integrators from having been there. But this is from Louise on LinkedIn. She says that she's really enjoying the discussion. One of the reasons I left an SI and became an independent consulting was just such conflicts of interest as I became more senior in my career. So that's exactly why I left the big system integrator too. There's something about it didn't feel right, and there's other reasons too. But that conflict of interest and that feeling of extreme bias and not necessarily doing what was in the client's best interest it just didn't sit well with me, and so for that reason I ended up moving on. So I'm glad we share that same sentiment. This is a little bit different question, but really important one, building on a point you made earlier, Clifford, about how to have the right statement of work and the contract and setting expectations up front. Along those same lines, though, the question from Abdul on YouTube is, what kind of KPIs should a company be looking for during or post implementation of an SAP project? And actually, I think this question to any sort of ERP project, whether it's SAP or any other system. Can you kindly share your views on that? What are your thoughts?
Great question. And you know, Eric, it's such an important topic, and it's this whole issue of benefits realization. And companies start off with very lofty and noble ideals encapsulated in their business cases and program charters and so on. And very quickly that gets left behind, and we're all kind of in the trenches, stuck in this ERP project now, just trying to survive and make the go live date. So I certainly advise clients that in parallel to the project rollout, we have a benefits realization work stream that starts with taking the business case, the stated benefits or the envisaged benefits in the business case, unpacking that in more detail, baselining that against the current company metrics. As an example, if we're pursuing operational excellence, which is often a very important role and kind of fairly standard objective of an ERP, I don't think you should ever be implementing an ERP if you're at least not going to drive some best practices and operational excellence and improved operational performance. So there's certain key metrics, and of course, a lot of the tier one ERPs these days come with those tools. On the SAP side, something like value lifecycle management, they're embedded and part of the ERP solution. But I don't think clients are aware of them enough, and certainly don't use them enough. So I do think the benefits realization needs to be a separate stream. It needs to be owned, and of course, one can get external assistance. It needs to be owned by the organization. It needs to drive a lot of the decisions we're making. If we're looking to land new capabilities, let's use e-commerce as an example of a recent client. That's one of the reasons to enable new business capabilities within the organization of your ERP platform, then that needs to form a key part of the design. Now, you spoke about the cookie cutter approach earlier. We cannot then have the SI coming in and having a uniform standard approach when we are well aware that in a particular area of the business, we're wanting to really get a mature capability in place. We've got to then, kind of focus the design around that, the testing around that, the user training around that, and that's got to inform and drive the project lifecycle. So if we don't have this benefits realization program, and we don't understand what we're trying to get out of the system and ensure that we scope and approach the different phases of the rollout or implementation with that in mind, then we lose sight of those benefits realizations, and unsurprisingly, we never achieve them. So the whole area of having a parallel benefits realization work stream, utilizing the tools that are available to inform and drive those benefits out during the project and post-go-live, I think is fundamentally important.
Yeah, great point. It ties back to your point about that clarity of a vision of what you want to get out of the system. What do we, first of all, what do you want this transformation to be? What's the intent? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the sort of the high level parameters and guardrails? Having those clear expectations and understandings, as well as the metrics that support that. It's just another arrow in your quiver to give you more ownership and more control and more accountability of the project as well.
Yes.
Just a quick comment here from Paramala, which is a really cool name. I may be mispronouncing it, but I like that name a lot. I totally agree with Clifford. So I'm not sure which part she agrees with, but maybe it's just in general. But at least someone listening here today agrees with you and I here in the discussion. And then Kyler, who's our co-host of this show, of this podcast, pointed out that we have a new buzzword alert. And if you listen to the Transformation Ground Control podcast often, which if you don't, I encourage you to, I don't want to say we make fun of buzzwords, but we have a good time with buzzword alerts on that show. So you helped us create another one. So thank you, Clifford, with that. Professional skepticism, which I'm going to steal that idea, by the way. So I guess we've talked a lot about some of these bigger system integrators, and that was sort of the last thread that I had asked you about, Clifford. But what about smaller SIs? And you started to talk a little bit about this, about how some of the tier 2 system integrators may be lesser known. They don't have the brand name recognition. You don't see their billboards at airports, or they're not sponsoring golf tournaments. So you may not know them as well, but there's some really good ones out there that can be more flexible, more willing to negotiate. What are some of the pros and cons of working with someone other than one of the big tier 2 system integrators?
Yes. So I think with the tier 2 system integrators, they don't generally have the breadth and depth of skills that a tier 1 would bring. And especially if, as happens, there's some churn and turnover of resources on projects, they're not necessarily able to instantaneously replace them with a similar level skill. So that is a risk. I do also think that sometimes their implementation methodologies are not as robust or comprehensive. And certainly I'll give credit where it's due. The tier 1 SIs have a well-tuned, comprehensive and robust implementation methodology, whether they borrow that from the solution providers, an Activate or a SureStep, or in the case of SAP and Microsoft as examples, or whether they have their own. They're generally quite similar, but they bring that to the party. And I do believe that governance is such an important aspect in terms of being successful in this area, having effective governance. And so one does find that the implementation methodologies are a little bit lighter, perhaps a bit weaker. They don't necessarily have all the trackers and templates and tools that come with the tier 1s, and the one therefore has to augment that yourself. And that, of course, implies that you do need to, as the client, then if you are using a tier 2 SI or multiple tier 2 SIs, you do need a stronger program management office. You need to be kind of the glue that brings it all together and that drives the quality and the standards and is able to augment, whether it be on tools, methodologies, resources, skills, as and when required, and possibly play a bigger role. I would say. But perhaps that's not a bad thing. Perhaps, I do feel sometimes that drives greater ownership and involvement on the side of the client as well, because there isn't somebody, standing there saying, very happy to take control of your project and help you spend your money. So, yeah.
Yeah. What I've seen too is some of these tier 2 system integrators, and I agree with everything you just said, by the way, as far as some of the strengths and weaknesses. But another one I'd add is that a lot of times with the tier 2 system integrators, you're getting more senior people, because a lot of people start off their careers like you and I earlier in our careers worked at one of the big system integrators. But at some point, oftentimes, people get burned out, sort of mid-career and move somewhere else. And a lot of times they go to a smaller tier system integrator just because it's a better fit, it's less stressful, and for other reasons. Have you seen that as well?
Yes, absolutely. I do think one has, you have the attention of the executive. And of course, it's often a bigger account for them, relatively speaking, than it would be for a tier 1 SI. And therefore, that you do kind of get more attention and quicker response to issues. So, I do agree with that.
All right, thanks for that, Clifford. We're going to take a quick break and jump back into this conversation. But before we do, we'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. Myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Clifford Martin. We're talking about how to manage system integrators and how to hold them accountable. Let's jump back into the conversation. First of all, a comment here from Louise, strong governance PMO. She strongly agrees with those points. And I think regardless of what type of system integrator you use, whether it's a big one, small one, tier 2, having that program management in place is really important. And then here's another question from Sam Graham again on LinkedIn, which is a really interesting one and a good question, as always, with Sam. Is it true that many very large organizations are actually an amalgam of smaller business units, and so tier 2 systems can sometimes be an option? So in other words, if you're a big company, but on paper you look like maybe you should be deploying an SAP or an Oracle, but really you're just a bunch of smaller business units that combine to create a big overall business, that might be that a tier 2 system or multiple tier 2 systems might be the better answer. Is that something you've seen as well?
Sure. I think the question is always with those types of organizations to tier or not to tier. And do we have a model that one sees often is in terms of the transactional commoditized type business processes, the back office, generic business processes, HR, payroll, procurement, supply chain, etc. One has some type of shared service model, and that might be on a tier 1 solution because some of them are pretty good at that. That's where they come from. And then in terms of agility and the more unique or even customer-facing components of the organization, there's a tier 2 solution in place, and possibly even multiple tier 2 solutions from different solution providers or vendors. So certainly, I do think that's a critical question. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all for the entire organization. or you do have a central head office with multiple branches or multiple subsidiaries and divisions, and especially when they're in different demographics or countries, time zones, etc. Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think one should always consider that for those types of organizations.
Right. Now, what about this question? Here's a question from YouTube, and I'm actually going to broaden the question a little bit from the original intent, but hopefully it'll still cover what you're looking for here, Abdul. But the question is, do you have any general advice on implementing AI technology with system integrators? What should we focus on? And maybe instead of just AI, maybe I'll talk about, why don't we talk about just bleeding edge or emerging technologies, new stuff like AI, robotic, process automation, machine learning. A lot of times these system integrators and software vendors are really pushing some of these newer emerging technologies, which may or may not make sense for where you are as an organization in your journey. And you really have to look at, how big of a jump is that? Are we ready to make that leap now? Should it be in the first phase? Maybe it's a later phase that we deploy it. How would you suggest that an organization navigate some of those decisions around newer, more robust, emerging technologies with the system integrator? How do you suggest they handle that?
Yes, and I think, Eric, perhaps to start in terms of responding to that question, as you correctly say, the tier one vendors, these days it's about the digital platform, not just kind of the ERP back office system, and they do or claim to have these new emerging technologies, whether it's machine learning or AI, IoT, whatever the case may be. And yeah, and to a large extent that is true, but there are still maturing solutions, and they're not necessarily fully matured in the marketplace yet. So certainly those types of solutions are gaining traction and are being deployed and effectively deployed. But I think the client organization needs to ask themselves, as you alluded to, are they ready for this? Do we have a digital savvy executive? Do we have that type of innovative culture that's going to be able to exploit these types of technologies? And very importantly, have we bedded down the basic foundation and our transactional backbone within the organization, because we cannot innovate off an unstable foundation. And too often, I think organizations want to take this leap and are pushed by the market, and certainly by the solution providers and the SIs, to move into that emerging digital technology space, but they have not yet bedded down that core foundation that allows them to just be in the game, not necessarily to win in their markets, but at least to play the game. And I think it's fundamentally important that we get that part of the organization stabilized, and that there's a very specific use case and business case for engaging any SIs or deploying any of these so-called emerging technologies.
Yeah, and some of these emerging technologies, especially if you look at AI, which is what the specific question was focused on. You look at something like an AI, which really threatens, in many ways, it threatens the status quo. It threatens employees' jobs, because you're potentially automating what someone was manually doing or decision making that someone was making in the past. So the technology itself may be the right fit, or it could be a good strategic enabler for your organization longer term. But shorter term, you've got a real change management issue, which when you look at some of these emerging technologies, I would argue that change management becomes even more important than it already was, which was already very important. But now it's even more important because you're disrupting the status quo even more than you already were. So I guess it kind of leads me to another question, just more of a general question, is what are some of the missing competencies that system integrators don't necessarily have, or they don't do well, even if they tell you they do? What are some of those competencies that are oftentimes lacking, but yet those competencies are going to be critical to the success of your project? So we need to be aware of them and figure out how we're going to plug those gaps. What are some thoughts that come to mind there?
Yes, I think that there's some very basic ones, which one almost never sees an SI take responsibility for. So in the data ETL or extraction transformation load area, that is often something that is absent from an SI agreement. Certainly training, SIs like to use this train the trainer approach. I don't think it's particularly effective.
Agreed.
And there are a number of ones, but Eric, the one that always kind of trips clients up is user acceptance testing. And one often finds that the contracts are structured in a way that The SI is accountable for the integration testing. So let's say 2 or 3 integration test cycles leading up to user acceptance testing. But that's a critical handover point. And clients fail to organize properly for it and properly interrogate the system and recognize that you are now taking on the solution. And your job as a client now is to assess whether the solution's been built in accordance with the design that you gave the SI in the blueprinting or design phase. And clients fail to recognize that they need to organize themselves accordingly to fulfill what is an extremely important role, because beyond that point, you kind of lose your right to recourse. It's a bit late, and specifically post-go live. So being able to build capability to, at critical junctures or intervals in the project, step in and say, does this make sense? Am I happy with this? And then step out and hand that back to the SI. And say, yes, we're kind of happy with this. You can now go ahead and deploy the solution. Or even, let me use a typical example. I sit on a number of client steering committees for ERP projects. And very often, and it's quite concerning, go live or deployment decisions are made in one of 2 ways. The SI walks into the meeting, to the final steering committee meeting, where we're going to approve or make the decision whether to go live or not, and says we're ready to go live, and the executive kind of looks at their toes and everybody nods in agreement, and it's a 5-minute meeting and we go live, and often the issues. Or the SI walks into the steering committee meeting and says we're ready to go live, and there's a whole debate about the extent to which we're ready to go live, and is there proper evidence available? What are the key criteria? Is there evidence to support it? Have we met all the necessary competencies, business readiness and training and all those good things in place? And there's a debate about it and a distinct lack of evidence to support any decision. So I think that's just an example of where organizations need to ensure that they are able to build capability to properly interrogate these decisions and make informed decisions on their project and the extent to which they are ready to move from one phase to the next, or sign off on deliverables, or deploy the solution, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, really good point. And it's it's another important milestone in the project that is really, really important for organizations and their internal project teams to take ownership of. So in other words, it's only you that should be deciding whether or not you're ready to move past this user acceptance testing into ultimately the training and go live that happens after that. And a lot of times organizations defer too much to the software vendors, or the system integrators, I should say. And ultimately, you really do have to say, are we ready? How confident do we feel? It's amazing to me, we do a lot of expert witness work, which is, for those that don't know, it's expert witness work is when you're supporting a lawsuit. So there's a lawsuit that involves an ERP implementation. Typically, a system integrator and or software vendor gets sued because something goes wrong. And in those failures that we see in these expert witness cases, it always fascinates me how often you hear this dynamic of the organization saying, well, the system integrator told us that everything was fine. They told us that the status was green, across the board. Maybe there's a couple of yellows, but nothing major. But yet we went live and it was a total disaster. So you can't. That's unacceptable. You can't let that happen. And you have to know. And back to our opening comments about educating yourself and knowing enough to challenge and ask questions and challenge assumptions. You have to know enough to know whether or not the status is really green. If it's red and someone's telling you it's green, you should know enough to know that that's not a green status. Things are not going well, or we're not ready, or here's the risk that we need to mitigate. And that's a big challenge that a lot of organizations face with these system integrators.
Professional skepticism.
But yeah, professional skepticism. Yes, be a skeptic and be pleasantly surprised if you're being overly skeptic. It's very rare, though, that I see organizations be too skeptical. Typically, they're too optimistic, or they believe too much, and you really have to be you have to challenge it in many ways. So I guess just to wrap it up, I feel like we could talk easily another hour about this topic, maybe even more. But maybe just to wrap it up, what is sort of a capstone question here. What sort of closing advice would you leave for an organization that's about to embark on a digital transformation? Maybe they're in the process of managing a system integrator, or they're trying to figure out what system integrator is the best fit for them. What are just some general, high priority, what are those highest priority summarizations of best practices as far as managing your system integrator and just setting yourself up for better success?
Yeah. So very quickly, Erica, given that we're at the end of the session. So, I think one has to own the project, and I know that's a bit of a buzzword, but you have to actually own it and understand what you're wanting out of it. I think one has to ensure that you you manage that and you negotiate an appropriate contract, and that you understand exactly what the SI is doing and what they're not doing, and therefore what you need to take responsibility for. I think having the organizational structure in place, it stays the client's project, and we haven't kind of even touched on things like the typical pairing model that SIs bring to the party, where they create two parallel project structures and never shall they meet, with the SI project team reporting to the SI and everybody else kind of reporting to the SI as well. So, it's so important in terms of how you structure the project, the types of roles, the stakeholder engagement, the people you bring on board, the oversight, and then what do you define as success going forward, and what constitutes success, and having a common uniformed view amongst the executive and key stakeholders as to what constitutes success. And perhaps the last point I would make is it makes sense to use a third party. Have someone in an assurance and advice role. The cost of such a role is generally negligible in terms of the overall capital cost of the project. And set up, and embedded in the contract up front, set up some type of quality metrics with regular stage gates and check-ins at critical intervals in the project timeline, to have someone independent assess, are we on track? Are we happy with these deliverables? And kind of keep the SI honest, if you want. So 4 or 5 key areas, but I do think it makes sense to ensure that you do get independent advice and ongoing support throughout the project lifecycle. And if you have the capabilities in place to do that, fine. But if not, I think it's very important that one has that in place.
Yeah. And there's times when we're talking about this topic where I feel like our job as consultants is to be sort of a self-help or a motivational speaker of sorts, like telling organizations, you can do this. You can take ownership. You're good enough. You can own this yourself. Don't let someone tell you how this project is going to work. Make the decisions that are best for you. And it's amazing how just that mindset alone, addresses a lot you just mentioned, is just take ownership. I mean, it's your project. Do what you need to do. And, certainly the system integrator is one work stream, one important work stream in the project, but that's only one work stream. You need an internal program manager or someone representing you that's managing the overall program, including the system integrator. You might have external third-party resources, like you mentioned, some clients you've worked with, and I have as well, that have independent contractors that they pull in and manage for certain things, and that's fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Your system integrator may not agree with you. They may tell you that's a terrible idea because they want that business, they want that revenue. But you find good resources out there. That's a good way to diversify risk. It's a good way to give you more ownership. It's a good way to just bring in the skills that you need. But then there's all the other stuff like the data migration, the change management, the process improvement, architecture, integration, all that stuff that's outside the purview of what a system integrator typically does well. So you just have to sort of take that ownership and look at the big picture and make sure you're addressing all those areas. All right. Thanks, Clifford. Thanks for being here. Great to have you on the show. Hope to see you again soon on this show. And I know we could have talked about that topic for another hour at least, but we'll spare the audience that additional detail. We'll have you back to talk more about that. And in fact, when we come back from a quick break, we're going to talk about some of the points that were brought up here during our discussion. But first, we'll take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Kyler, and we just had Clifford Martin on the show talking about system integrators, how to manage them, how to hold them accountable. What were some of your thoughts and observations from that discussion, Kyler?
Yeah, so this might be a very elementary question, but as the business technologist I am, I'm not sure why you need a system integrator. Like, do you always need one? Or it seems as though it would be a great solution just to cut them out of the entire process. So, so
It's almost like a necessary evil. I mean, depending on who you are, I mean, as an organization, most organizations find that they need some sort of expertise in whatever product it is they're implementing. Now, having said that, there are some bigger organizations that prefer to build that competency in-house, which in fact, I encourage that. And to your point, do you really need the system integrators? Could you hire the people directly? Could you hire people internally? There's a lot of different alternatives, but I think you bring up a bigger point, which is you don't have to settle for, Accenture or Deloitte just because everyone knows who Accenture or Deloitte is. There's a common a common phrase that I've always took exception to in the industry, which is, I think it originated with IBM, or it was in reference to IBM. People would say, no one ever gets fired for hiring IBM because it's a well-known name. They're a proven commodity. They've been around forever. The only problem is I know a lot of people that have been fired for hiring IBM. I know a lot of people that have been fired for and sued, by the way, for hiring Accenture, for hiring Deloitte, insert system integrator here. So it's not necessarily safer. In some ways, it's actually riskier to hire some of these big system integrators, not because they don't know what they're doing, but because, like I said at the beginning of the intro to Clifford, goals are misaligned, people act in self-interest, and those two things combined with the fact that these large system integrators generate so much revenue from these bigger projects, it just creates this dynamic that isn't healthy. In fact, the bigger the system integrator, the more this is true, it seems that they feed off and thrive more the more incompetent or incapable that you are as an organization. So it's almost like they're being rewarded for creating this learned helplessness from their clients, because the more helpless the clients are, the more they need these technical resources, the less likely they are to challenge those technical resources, AKA, why do you have 100 people on this project? Do you really need to staff this with 100 people? Could we do it with 50? Could we do it with 30? Or whatever the number may be. So those are the sorts of things that, you have to ask yourself. But to your point, no, you don't need a system integrator. You certainly don't need a big one. I think a lot of companies think they have to hire a big one. There's a ton of really good second and third tier implementers and resellers and system integrators out there that too many organizations just overlook.
yeah, and I know you and Clifford had mentioned that a lot of times those tier two SIs are honestly more valuable because a lot of them were senior executives at Accenture or Deloitte and had, left to have maybe a little bit more professional flexibility or a little less bias, being pushed to do things that they, weren't exactly aligned with. So a lot of times that's kind of like a wealth of knowledge there, it seems like, and a great opportunity.
Yeah, it is, because, I think the average tenure at those firms is like 2 years. And that's about how long I was at Price Waterhouse when I started my career. Because it's sort of like you're either going to really thrive in that environment and you're going to go on to like a partner track and you're buying into that model, or not. And if you're not, you're not going to last long. I didn't last long because I just couldn't tolerate the environment, the culture, the biases, the internal politics is just nauseating. I actually feel a little bit nauseous just thinking about some of the politics that would happen and the crap you have to deal with, pardon the language, the garbage you have to deal with as a consultant there. But having said that, it was a great place to learn. It was a great place to start my career. But I don't think the value I added, to clients that early in my career was worth what they paid for my services. But guess what? No one asked questions. No one asked, why is this kid billing 60 hours a week at $200 an hour or whatever it was I was billing at the time. No one asked those questions, which was fascinating to me. So that's on the system integrators, but it's also on the organizations that hire the system integrators. Why do you let that happen? Would be the question I'd have for executives.
Yeah, and that term professional skepticism that Clifford coined throughout your conversation, and just kind of managing to that. And I wanted to ask you about something he mentioned that you could ask for within the contracting phase, since he did stress like that's really where the contracting phase, the statement of work, that's where everything is going to stem from, and making sure that's tightened up. So when we're talking about moving from time deliverables to focus on the quality of deliverables, is that something that you can actually do, and saying like, I don't really want to be billed for your time. I want to be billed, which I'm happy to pay for, when we're done with the project. Not so much the billing timeline, but just the overall process of billing.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on that, because I think a lot of times organizations look for that silver bullet way of mitigating entirely that risk. And on one hand, I get where organizations are coming from. They might have milestone-based billing or quality-based billing or fixed bid projects. A lot of government, nonprofit types of organizations in bigger corporations really like the fixed bid model. They think that that's going to mitigate risk, but it just creates other risks that, in my opinion, are actually greater than the risk you've mitigated by having a fixed bid contract. With more of the quality or milestone or time-based billing, there's pros and cons to each, and there's not a good answer. I don't think you certainly want to get the right contract in place and make sure that you have the right governance, the right checkpoints, the right exit clauses and termination clauses, all that stuff. Maybe you want to tie payments to milestones. That can help. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what you really need is better project governance. I mean, if you just have better project governance and manage the system integrator, take a hands-on role and managing those outside resources, that's more than anything is what's going to solve the problem. You can try to address it contractually, or at least set yourself up for success contractually, but that alone is not going to solve the problem. You have to have good project governance, and the only person that can really provide that is you, the organization. And that's something that when we're working with clients during their implementations, that's part of what we do, is we help them get those controls in place. We help them provide that governance. We help them manage the system integrator so that they're not getting taken advantage of or overpaying for those services for questionable business value.
Absolutely. And both of you mentioned kind of that benefits realization work stream. So if you are talking to a client or helping them through kind of their relationship with their SI, how do you make sure that they are keeping a pulse on what is actually the benefits realization to the organization?
Well, the first is you've got to, introduce or integrate that work stream into the overall program. And again, that's usually not something that a system integrator or a technical implementer is going to bring to the table. And they may say it's not important because all we're trying to do here is implement technology. Some organizations actually downplay or dismiss the value of benefits realization because they say, well, we don't really have a choice here because we have to replace our technology, so it doesn't really matter what kind of benefits we get out of it. Well, that's like saying, we hate where we live, we've got to go somewhere, so let's just start driving. It's not really a good answer. It's probably going to get you somewhere different than where you are now, but not necessarily anywhere better. You could end up somewhere a lot worse. So you need to have that benefits realization in place and that framework to measure, to hold people accountable, both your system integrator and your internal resources, all that stuff. And the other thing too, by the way, is it keeps you focused on business value throughout the implementation. It keeps you from going down all these rabbit holes and side paths that don't add any value and increase the cost and take away the focus of the project.
That's really interesting. One of the other interesting pieces of that is kind of that go live decision making. I had just pictured in my head like this bunker type of visualization with like this big red button where everyone's in the room and they're ready to go and they've planned on this for years, and that type of overall scenario. However, it sounds like a lot of times the SI helps dictate that decision, which I assume they would be like involved in that collaboration. But based on what Clifford was saying, a lot of times they kind of just tell the business like, it's now, go. And then, that a lot of times that doesn't end up working out in the best and most successful process. So I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a sort of a CYA, cover your arse mentality that system integrators have. They don't want to. It doesn't in the short term, it doesn't serve them well to point out all the problems with the project or anything that could be perceived as a problem that they created or they let happen or whatever. So there's human egos involved in this, and that's a real problem in that it's almost like the fox is guarding the hen house. The fox is saying everything's fine, don't worry about it. It's all green. There's a couple of yellows here, but we've got a plan to address that. And then when things, hit the fan, what ends up happening, the other dynamic that happens is, well, no problem. Yep, this happens. We've got a plan to remediate. And, oh, by the way, you're not doing your job, client. And here's all the things you need to do to fix this. In my opinion, a lot of that can be avoided, but I think a lot of these system integrators are masters of spinning reality to say, hey, this is normal. It's normal to have this total chaos, and you go live and you can't ship product. That just happens. Well, no, it shouldn't happen. It does happen more than it should, but it should not happen. There's absolutely no reason why you should let that happen, but yet system integrators let it happen time and time again. And a lot of times, especially when we look at these expert witness projects where we're involved with helping support a lawsuit and provide an opinion in a lawsuit, what we find is you're ready to go live and the system integrator is telling you the project status is green, 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 green. We did our go live checklist. Everything checks positively and we're ready to roll. And I'd say half of that or more of those results or those outputs are influenced by the need to make us look good. Like, look at everything we've done. A lot of times there's a lot of pressure, like, we need to go live. You guys are taking too long. Typically there's delays along the way. So that just further adds to the pressure. So the system integrator and the humans in decision making or making recommendations oftentimes are acting in their own, just imperfect human ways that are contributing to these failures.
Yeah, I guess it's just mind blowing to me because it's like if you're providing that really truly terrible of a customer experience, how do you get things like references? Like, I get you might not be like courting for follow-on work, and you kind of just like drop the mic and leave, but it seems as though there has to be some level of accountability on them, and it just seems like they're completely unmonitored.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to be in business, I mean, you have to have a certain number of minimum successful clients out there, right? If you don't, you're not gonna last. But it's relatively easy to find, even if you just pick 5 or 10% of your customers that are referenceable, but the other 90% are not. If you have 5 or 10% that are, that means you can not screw up 5 or 10% of the time and have pretty good references. The other thing too is that there's a lot of bias out there, especially a lot of what I'm saying, by the way, is again more true for the larger system integrators than it is for the second or third tier ones. But for the big system integrators, there's just a huge amount of bias in the industry, partly because they're so well known, and partly because a lot of those people at those larger firms, they leave and they go work in industry, and they have a favorable bias toward those system integrators. So in other words, they were part of the problem when they were working at the system integrator. They go into industry and they perpetuate the problem by hiring the same type of organization that was creating problems when they were there, but they don't necessarily see it that way because it was a positive experience for them. When I was at Price Waterhouse, I learned a ton. There was some definite positives there, but it always bothered me that I felt like it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel like we were acting in clients' best interest. But a lot of people, I'd say probably most people that leave the Big Five don't see it that way. They see it as a positive thing, and they're not necessarily thinking about what could have made the client more successful or why did the client screw up. So I don't know if I have a bit of a jaded view on that, I'll admit, but that's my opinion of the situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, Adam, my husband, has a similar story, which I won't completely share, but where he was put in a situation where he really felt like the integrity of who he was as a professional was being called into question because of what he was being forced to tell a client. And I think for him, that was the breaking point. And I've been in similar situations when it comes to a corporate career where it doesn't feel right. Like the things that you're doing for your customer isn't something that kind of matches your integrity of a person. So I definitely get that. I think it's just amazing to me that there isn't more, I guess, competition on that level, because every business needs software. And it almost reminds me of like telecom, right? You want TV? This is your TV. Here. This is all the TV you can have. This is what you get. Oh, you want a cell phone? Oh, okay. Well, you can have T-Mobile or Verizon, or AT&T. Like, there's no tier 2, if you will, of mobile carriers out there that will provide the same amount of service. So it kind of reminds me of those marketplaces where there just isn't as much competition to make people be honest, really, with their customers and clients.
And to add to that, I agree with you. To add to that too, there's no regulation. in this space. There's no government rules and regulations for how this stuff works. If you're on the audit side or tax, those big firms that also do audit and tax, those parts of the business are heavily regulated. But when you get into digital transformation and ERP consulting, that is not at all regulated. So you add those two factors, the fact that you have these big, massive, well-known players, that they're heavily concentrated, combine that with the fact that they've got a poor track record and there's no government or regulatory accountability or any other sort of accountability for that matter, that's a problem.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to talk to you and Nate, who both have, decades of experience in the industry, and hear kind of why you both chose kind of the more independent, agnostic path, when it's really not the easiest path to choose, from our conversation. So I'm excited to kind of play that clip for our audience today.
Yeah, and I am too, and it's a good conversation that goes into why having an objective, agnostic view of your entire project from start to finish is so important. And that is something else, by the way, that's missing from most, if not all, system integrators, is they're so focused and specialized in one technology that's all they see is my technology has to fit within your business. Every possible nook and cranny, I can make it fit. Whereas if you take a more agnostic approach, you're going to have a different perspective. You're not trying to force fit technology where it doesn't belong. You're not looking at it just from a technology perspective. You're looking at the more important people and process and strategy issues. And that's part of what we'll talk about with Nate here in just a minute. But before we get to that, though, let's take a quick break. We'll have Nate Stroeher on the show talking about technology agnostic approaches to digital transformation. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham and excited to introduce our next guest. And it's actually a clip we're going to play you of our next guest, which is Nate Stroeher. He's the director of strategy and transformation. He's practice lead here at Third Stage in the United States. And he is in a video here that Kyler hosted and facilitated, asking questions about technology agnostic implementations. What does it mean? Why is it important? And so let's just jump into the clip and we'll debrief afterwards. So here's the clip with Nate talking to Kyler and I about technology agnostic approaches to digital transformation.
I'm Kyler Cheatham here with Nate Stroeher and Eric Kimberling, and today we're going to talk about what is technology agnostic. So Eric, let's start with you. How did you get involved in independent consulting and technology agnostic information?
Well, it started earlier in my career, having worked for one of the big system integrators that was not system or software agnostic, finding that there's a huge amount of bias in the industry and the work that I was doing early in my career. And so that really just stimulated an idea or a perceived need for independence. Just because as I continue my career, I found that there's not a lot of consulting firms out there that are truly independent. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to start a consulting firm that specialized in ERP and digital transformation, but also one that was completely agnostic and representing clients' best interest rather than vendor best interest.
Sure. And Nate, if you were to define technology agnostic, what would you say?
I think it's best summed up that you're going to choose the best solution for your client. And I think it's important that with agnostic, when we talk about software agnostic or platform agnostic, technology agnostic, that we all have biases. So whether you know it or not, or whether you have your interest financially to lead someone to a platform or a technology, when you're agnostic, you're really you you eliminate a lot of those biases, whether they're perceived or they're real. It's just you're giving them what's best for them.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about independence, let's just kind of lay it all out there for our audience. Do you have any relationship with vendors? We'll probably start with you, Eric. Any sort of financial kickbacks or anything like that?
Yeah, no, we don't have any sort of financial tie to vendors. So the key litmus test for us is, do we have anything to gain financially or otherwise by recommending any one solution? And if the answer is no, we don't have anything to gain, then we're being truly independent. Really all we care about is what the client's needs are and making sure we address the client's satisfaction and their operational needs.
So Nate, what if you had a bad experience with a previous vendor on another client or something like that? Do you ever take those biases or that information into your recommendations?
Well, I don't. I think it's kind of important. There's obviously people that you want to work with and that you don't want to work with, but I think it's important to know that with the big technology platforms, there's a team that you're going to work with. So just because you might have a bad experience with one individual on the team or one team out of many of their teams, that doesn't really represent the technology. So again, it's really back to the best fit for the customer. But there is also a little bit of a bias in the sense that we've worked around technology enough that we have a good sense of what is a good fit for customers. And we know with a lot of the implementation providers who are good to work with and who are going to be the better teams to introduce to a smaller customer, to a larger customer. So I would say that we're still agnostic, but we do know through our experience in over 20 years in this field who's going to be a best fit for certain customers.
Sure. So it sounds like you have industry insight as opposed to bias.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, Eric, when you hire people at Third Stage, how do you make sure that they're not bringing any other vendor relationships or anything like that? What kind of expectations do you set for your team?
Well, it's a good question, because that's probably the hardest, or one of the hardest aspects of our business model, is finding good people that are knowledgeable of digital transformation, technology transformation, business transformation, all that stuff, but at the same time aren't solely focused on one solution. So typically we don't hire many, if any, consultants that had specialized in one solution and that's it. So someone with 20 years of SAP or Microsoft or whatever the type of experience might be wouldn't necessarily completely disqualify them, but those types of skill sets are harder to break out of that bias or that myopic focus on one technology. So most of the team members we have, if not all of them, have worked across technology platforms. Maybe not every one of them, obviously. Even I haven't worked with every system out there, but collectively, we hire people that have touched 2, 3, 4, 5 different systems throughout their careers, and they know how to deploy them. They know the strengths and weaknesses of each, and they just tend to have a more balanced view of the market than someone that grew up in one specific niche or one vertical.
Certainly. Yeah, that makes sense. So, Nate, do you ever experience client bias? Like, say a vendor got to a client before they hired someone like Third Stage, and that client is like, I'm definitely going to need this software. And if so, how do you work through that?
Oh, definitely, and almost every client, and in a positive and a negative way. We've, without naming technologies, we'll start on kickoff calls, and someone will say, well, I had a bad experience with this software. We don't even want to consider it. In fact, a client that we kicked off 3 weeks ago said we're not looking at this technology, and now they end up being one of our shortlist vendors that we're going to be working with. So there's always that past experience of a good or a bad relationship with a software or with an implementation provider. I think the one thing that helps, that we always try and talk to our clients about, is that was a completely different situation, and not all past implementations that were either successful or unsuccessful are a result of simply the software or the implementation provider's performance. There is two people in that relationship. There's a client and there's the implementation provider. So as much as we can coach them through the fact that was a past situation, the technology that you dealt with in the past is much different likely than what you're going to deal with today. And the more we can give them try as much as we can to clear their mind of what happened in the past. But we're all human, and we all have emotional baggage that you deal with. And it's also in a positive way. Like sometimes just because you had a good solution 15 years ago, the technology might not be good anymore. And so don't keep driving us down that road when we know there's a better solution that we could introduce you to.
Yeah, absolutely. And building on that, Eric, from a independent perspective, do you ever recommend something to a client and then they don't choose it? And what kind of happens with that situation?
Yeah, we have a subset of clients over the years that hire us because they want us to tell them what they want to hear. And so oftentimes you'll get a CIO or someone high up in the organization that is, to Nate's points, is sort of leaning a certain way. They grew up or in their past experiences, they have familiarity and comfort with a certain product. A lot of times it's one of the bigger vendors like SAP or Oracle or Microsoft. And a lot of times they'll sort of do their own evaluation. They'll come to the conclusion that they want that same solution for their organization, but there's not internal confidence in that direction, so they hire us to come in and do an independent assessment. So a lot of times we fight internal biases where you're telling the client, we need to tell the client the reality and the truth versus not necessarily what they want to hear. Sometimes it works out that it is what they want to hear and it sort of validates the way they were thinking, but a lot of times it's a recommendation that runs counter to what their biases are. Now, there are times too where we make a recommendation and the client goes against that. And they'll say, well, we like the second option better for these reasons, or maybe they weight the criteria a little bit differently than what we had originally done in the assessment. And sometimes that's driven by bias and kind of getting to the answer they want. Other times it's just other forces at play in terms of them going in a different direction.
Yeah. And Nate, how do you collaborate with vendors, specifically when you're brought into a project that might not be on track or achieving the objectives that the client is looking for? How do you make sure that you treat the vendor as a partner, but you also maintain your independence?
I think what we try and do, or at least from my point of view and the teams that I work with, is you try and give everyone the same opportunity to succeed at a client. If they take that or not is really their game to win or lose. And a good example, and I keep going back to these examples that we've had in the last couple months, is a lot of the vendors will hold a discovery call with the client to learn before they fill out the RFP and before they do the demo, just exactly what the client's needs are and how some of the specific niches in their business can be satisfied. The vendors that want to come in and have these discovery sessions, and the more interaction they want to have with the client, they have the opportunity to, and we'll work with them to give them as much time in front of the client as they want and as they need. If a vendor doesn't want to do it, we've at least made the opportunity for them to do it. So again, I think it's just treating them all the same, giving them all the same opportunities, and really giving them the opportunity to succeed or fail based on their performance.
Interesting. And what happens if you have a bad demo, but the solution might be a good choice? Does that ever happen?
Yeah, I think it happens almost. Yes is the answer. That one. Yeah, there's a couple things, and a lot of times a vendor will shoot themselves in the foot, and they're done. What we try and do, and I think it probably. We're successful about 95% of the time, is we try and have 2 or 3 solutions that are all going to be the right solution for our client. So if someone fails, we have 2 in the wings that are going to be a good solution. Some of the vendors will come in and say that just wasn't our best performance, and they'll have the opportunity to make it up to the client and come in and have either another demo or demo the pieces that they didn't really do a good job showing how they can match their requirements. So it's just kind of a case-by-case basis. But a lot of times you get one shot, and if you really blow it, you blow it.
Yeah.
And our job a lot of times is to differentiate between just a blown demo because the sales rep or the person doing the demo just isn't good, or they're just not connecting with the client's needs for whatever reason, versus ones where it truly is a problem with the technology and that's why the demo bombed. There's a glaring deficiency in the product, therefore they couldn't demo it very well. So usually it falls into one of those 2 camps, and so a lot of what the values we bring is to help differentiate the difference between is it a product problem or is it the way the product was demoed. And a lot of what we use too is just data from our own database, the quantitative data, to help either validate, is that consistent with what we saw in the demo, or is there some sort of discrepancy that we need to follow up on? Our data shows one story, and we have experience that tells one story, and then what we saw in the demo is something different, and we've got to figure out how to reconcile that.
And the one thing to add on to that, there's always two parts to a demo. There's the technology fit, and vendors are gonna, they're all, if they've made the short list, they're going to be pretty comparable as far as being able to meet the needs of the client. And then there's that whole cultural fit, the soft side of it. And I think the worst thing that a vendor can do, and the quickest way to not have a repeat demo or not have a second chance to come in, is if they just didn't pay attention to the client, if they just didn't take the time to learn their business. Those are usually the tougher sells to get them back in the door, to show their product. If it's something that it was, there's technology glitches, there's misunderstandings as far as what a client's told the vendor. There's always going to be those situations, and for the most part, people are putting a lot of money and a lot of time into this process. And if they think that it's something worth pursuing, they'll give them a second chance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you guys have a lot of kind of hard or maybe uncomfortable conversations with clients when we talk about, recommending a technology that they might not have thought of before, or they have had a bad experience with, or the demos and making them kind of consider a demo that didn't go very well. Eric, how do you build that trust with your clients so that they really do kind of blindly trust you in these situations?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that most clients have a high level of trust just because of the independence of the technology agnostic model. So they know that we're not being driven by our own self-interest. We're not out to try and make commission on anything, because we don't make commission on our recommendations. But I think that, that just as big of a problem is having the tough conversations around maybe a product that could be a good fit that a client is biased against. I'd say, I'd be curious to see if you agree with this. It seems like more often than not, though, it's the opposite. It's that there's a bias toward a product, and we have to say, hey, we know you're enamored by all these cool bells and whistles, but the reality of how we're seeing this deployed at other clients tells this story. And so you sort of have to deflate their optimism a little bit, which that sometimes is even harder than convincing them that a product they think is terrible or isn't a good fit, convincing them that it is. So it goes both ways for sure. I don't know if it's greater than 50-50 or whatever. But.
Yeah, and we just had that conversation this week with a customer that said, you've recommended what we'll call 3 of the big 4 mid-market solutions, and they said we really want to maybe look at some of the open source solutions. We want to look at some of the smaller players. And we had to have that conversation to say, there are a lot of really good things about that. However, you have a really small IT budget, you have a small IT department.
Yeah.
There's so many things that keep you from wanting to pursue those opportunities, because you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
So, but sometimes you just, the client wants to look at that solution, and you let them look at that solution and let them learn for themselves. And, sometimes that's what it takes.
Yeah, yep, definitely. Those resources are so important. Eric, when it comes to the overall competitive nature of independent or technology agnostic firms, why aren't there more of them?
Well, I think just having started, 2 independent technology agnostic consulting firms now, I would say it's a lot harder because to start an independent firm, because you're not getting the support of software vendors. If you were to open up shop tomorrow that aligns with one of the big software vendors, they're going to immediately give you certification, they'll give you leads, they'll give you marketing support,
Sure.
and you sort of get wrapped into their whole ecosystem. So in the short term, it's a lot easier just to start a VAR or a consulting firm that's aligned with the software vendor. But like I said, there's plenty of them out there. I don't know how many there are, but if you look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft and all the different consultants out there that focus on that, there's tons of them. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. And the other part of it too, getting back to one of the earlier points about hiring and how difficult it can be to find good consultants that have broad experiences, there's just not a lot of them. Most consultants come up through their career focusing on one technology. So if they're going to start a consulting firm, chances are they're going to do what they know best, which is to focus on that one technology. So I think those 2 things combined are probably why there's not more independent firms out there, is just that sort of experience bias, and then also the fact that it's just easier in the short term to have a big vendor like SAP or Oracle or Microsoft feeding you leads and helping you get the firm off the ground.
Absolutely. And I think we can kind of wrap up on that note. So if you are a company, or if a company is watching this and they're considering not hiring an independent consultant, what are some of the risks associated with that?
Well, I'd say the biggest thing is just the biases, everything we talked about and that Nate was talking about with client biases. Organizations that don't implement various ERP systems for a living simply can't know what there is to need to know about the digital transformation and software space. So you're going to be limited by your own biases, by your own blind spots, and you're going to succumb to the pressure or the spun messaging that you get from vendors, which typically is going to mismanage expectations, and you're going to be overly optimistic, and it's not realistic, the picture that gets painted from software vendors. So if you don't know that, if you haven't been through that process, if you don't have an independent advisor, that's just going to further complicate things.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think there's a process that you go through with every selection and digital transformation project that there's important steps to take every time, and I could use different analogies for self-improvement, that sort of thing, but that it's those steps that really weed through what Eric referenced, and that is a vendor has their set way of showing you what their solution is, and it's obviously going to be the best way for them to highlight their strengths, and by using a real set methodology of examining, defining your requirements, examining all the different technologies and how they can not only satisfy your requirements but work with the other systems, and really look at that whole picture, you're really putting yourself in a much better position to control what the vendors are showing you versus them coming in controlling what they show you.
Yeah, it sounds like project ownership really is a main objective there.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Nate, Kyler. That was great to have you guys talking about that important topic. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. So for all you listeners of Transformation Ground Control, I wanted to remind you of a premier annual event that we host every year. It's called Digital Stratosphere. It's a virtual conference that we've actually shifted to virtual since the pandemic. And we're having our next Digital Stratosphere conference online, virtually, February 8th through the 10th. So I encourage you to register for that. We're going to, myself and others from the Third Stage team will be hosting sessions, facilitating sessions about software selection, how to implement software, what some of the best practices are, change management, digital strategy, program management, all the stuff you need to know to make your digital transformation successful in 2022 and beyond. This event's for you. Registration's free. We encourage you and your teams to join. If you're not able to join us live, which we hope you will, but if you can't join us live, we'll also have, we'll make the recordings available to you. So be sure to register either way. Even if you can't join all of the sessions live, you'll at least get access to the library of recordings. So I encourage you to check that out. There's a link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. There's a link below to register. And you can also just go to our website at Third Stage, and it's spelled THIRD, stage-consulting.com. At the top of the page, you'll see an icon for registering for Digital Stratosphere. So be sure to check it out. Digital Stratosphere, February 8th through 10th. Hope to see you there. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 54. I'm here with Kyler. We just had a discussion with Nate Stroeher talking about technology agnostic digital transformation. So now that you've had some time to digest that video, which you produced not too long ago with Nate and I, what are some of your takeaways from that, Kyler?
Yeah, I think that conversation is so important because a lot of times we get questions about like what does agnostic mean, or you must have some sort of partnerships, and we just truly don't. Like, for example, our Digital Stratosphere 2022 event that's coming up, or that is happening now, I should say, is a lot of vendors offer to sponsor that, and we, politely and respectfully say, no, that's not something that we're interested in. We really have no financial ties, or really ties in general, except for helping our customers to implement technology. One thing I want to just showcase to our audience is we kind of talked about what happens when you have to take a client and convince them that the software they're married to, that they've looked up, that they've Googled, is not the correct software for them within your recommendation. And I thought it was just so, you and Nate are just so good at saying like, well, I understand why you see that, but these are all of the different reasons why, and really laying out those deliverables and that documentation. But I can only imagine that that must be really difficult, especially if you have a team of people that really like one software and it's your job independently, not only with software vendors kind of whispering in your ear and whispering in the client's ear, but the client actually wanting that. And you coming in and saying, like, I understand it's a great software, but for your processes, this is not the best choice for you.
Right. Yeah, and it's always an interesting situation because it creates such chaos. Usually, a lot of times clients have narrowed down the field to two options, and they're sort of a split decision, and they want us to come in and help them get along and figure out what the right answer is. But a lot of times, what ends up happening is that you get the vendors who know that they've got this group in their hip pocket, but not that group, so they're going to go attack that group and talk about how the priority should be over here, and et cetera, et cetera. So it just gets to be a chaotic situation when you don't have structure behind how you evaluate, and that's where the structure sort of depersonalizes it, takes the emotion out of it, and looks more objectively and more quantitatively at how what the best solution is. And so that's why prioritization is so important. That's why you don't just have a laundry list of 1,000 requirements. Whoever meets the most requirements is going to win. It's not that simple. You have to prioritize your requirements, focus on the things that are most important to you as a business, and the things that are going to have the biggest differentiators among different systems out there. And that really helps you narrow it down a bit. And also, the other thing I'll say too is when you're dealing with opinions are open to influence. So it may be that a certain vendor just demos their product better, and therefore there's a perception that they're a better vendor. Well, that just means they have better salespeople in many cases. It doesn't mean it's a better product necessarily. So that's where our database of quantitative, objective, independent data to show how these different systems in the market compare across different functions and requirements. We've got I think over 30,000 different business requirements in our database with several hundred software solutions evaluated against those 30,000 requirements. And it's hard to argue with data. It's somewhat subjective because someone still had to evaluate how well a system could do, requirements A, B, and C, but it's an objective evaluation that it's harder to argue with in that way, and it becomes less personal. So that's one way to sort of cut through the politics and the internal dynamics and the vendor fighting that ends up going along with these sorts of decision processes.
Absolutely. It's just, being independent, it seems as though, you're coming in as the business advocate, but sometimes it's your job to tell the business, like, hey, we got to get a lot of things together before we can even really talk about what software we're going to select, because we don't even have any defined business processes, or we need to, get our data management under control. And I think a lot of people don't understand the agnostic is for business consulting too. It's not just for software. It's going in and completely revamping or helping our business partners and clients do process evaluations, understand their requirements, go in and host these workshops and really become one of the team, almost, completely immerse yourself into the business. So it's a process. It's just not about going in and saying, oh, you want to be able to, like Christy, I just hosted a podcast last week with Christy and talking about the integration of Shopify. It's not that you just want to sell your things online. It's about, well, where are they? How do you get them there? All of those different processes that a lot of times people don't realize that we're also advising on.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And Christy's one of our consultants, or actually she's I think senior manager now that focuses on our small and mid-sized companies. So good. We'll have to have her on the show sometime soon as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's great. She's actually on our Digital Stratosphere podcast this week. So she's talking about big data and small business as well. So she does a lot of great data management there. And she has another one coming up talking about family-owned businesses, which is very interesting, and the dynamics around those. But we digress.
Right, as we always do.
Yeah, exactly. And then, the other thing I thought was really interesting, just in your overall career paths, Nate worked for a bigger system integrator and left, to become more independent. And he kind of talked about his journey there, and so did you, and just seeing the overall opportunity in the marketplace. But again, it doesn't seem like a ton of people have seen that opportunity. And you kind of talked about how easy really it is for a software vendor to come in and say, like, hey, we'll give you a ton of money to start a consulting firm, but you make sure you kind of sell our product first, which I thought was really interesting, because I assume it must be a little bit harder to raise capital as an independent consulting firm as opposed to, getting a bunch of money from a bigger software firm.
Yeah, and it's not just the money you get too. It's also the lead generation, the BD support, and so there's a lot of appealing pieces of becoming a partner of a software vendor or an implementer or system integrator or all the above. In fact, it's one of the reasons why when I started Third Stage, I focused so much on creating a marketing engine that was totally self-sustainable and independent from the vendors. So in other words, we don't get leads from vendors. We don't get any sort of, we have no referral or commission arrangements with vendors. And so there's no economic interest. And I try to keep this as 100% pure, where there's absolutely no economic interest that we have in recommending one product over another or ensuring that a client buys more of a certain technology than not. The only masters we serve are our clients, and that's by design. That's really important. But if we were to have masters that were a software vendor, it's sort of like its own little echo chamber. You start hearing and drinking the same thing, or you start hearing the same things, you start drinking the same Kool-Aid, and it just becomes sort of like your own little reality. And so when you go to talk to clients, you've got an extreme bias that's well baked into your mindset, partly because you're going to get compensated by doing that, but also because that's all you've been exposed to. You've been listening to the same messaging, you've been drinking the same Kool-Aid for so long over time. Whereas we come at it from a fresh perspective because we have the luxury of not being tethered by those biases.
Absolutely. Well, definitely a great conversation with you and Nate, and we'll continue to kind of produce those videos just about what is the Third Stage overall brand, just so our audience community can get to know us a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Digital Stratosphere podcast, which is our sister podcast. We actually put out 3 episodes of that show every week, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You can find new episodes of that on whatever podcast platform you listen on. And then this podcast, Transformation Ground Control, comes out every Wednesday. Totally different format, too. This is more of a long form, call it a more traditional, I guess, podcast show, whereas Digital Stratosphere is more like 10 to 15 to 30 minute bite-sized chunks that are released more frequently. So it's just a different format depending on your style and what you're looking for. This is, I'd say, more of a deeper dive conversational approach. The Digital Stratosphere is more to the point, I guess I'd say, and more focused on specific topics. So be sure to check that out. If you like this show and you're looking for another podcast to listen to, that's another great one to check out too, which is Digital Stratosphere. You can find that the same place you find this podcast. So, well, great. Well, thanks for all the great analysis and discussion here today, Kyler. Really appreciate you being here as always. And thank you to the audience for being here today. Again, be sure to check out new episodes every Wednesday. Check us out at thirdstage-consulting.com. And also, if you weren't able to attend our Stratosphere event, which is actually happening this week digitally and virtually, it's happening this week as we speak. But if you're listening to this podcast too late or it's after the fact, be sure to go to stratosphere2022.com and you can actually listen to a recording of the event if you missed it, or if you happen to be listening to this podcast right when it comes out, you still have time to join some of the live sessions from February 8th to the 10th. So be sure to check out stratosphere2022.com if you'd like to just learn from other thought leaders in the space and just unpack some best practices around digital transformation a little bit more, and we'll look forward to having you there. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Have a great week. We'll see you next Wednesday. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control. We'll see you next time.